Hello guys, welcome back again. That's me, I'm Nafid. Today we will have a simple video. It is about ClearPass and switch authentication. So we're going to go and look at the service that we will create in the ClearPass and what settings that we need to perform on the switch, and we'll verify these connections. Let's go. That is the landing page of ClearPass. Click on ClearPass Policy Manager. Now this is ClearPass version 6.9, as you can see it from here. Even you can look at the bottom, you can see ClearPass 6.9 release 0 dot whatever. Now, bunch of things. Obviously, we will look later on at the actual switch, how to configure the switch to communicate with the ClearPass. And we have to make sure the switch has been added as an add device, which is ClearPass client, as we said before. In a previous video, we have showed you how to do that, but I will also demonstrate this one again, just as a revision. You go to configuration, you go to a network, devices. I've added devices, I call it Aruba mobility controllers, and that should include everything basically in the 10.1/16. Probably to make it more intuitive, what I'm going to do, I will just add the IP address of the switch, Aruba switch, and the switch will be 10.1.10.5, and that's a specific IP address of the switch where the client is going to be connected to. And the shared secret, I'm going to use Aruba 123, and then we leave everything as is, Aruba as a vendor name, and so on. So we click on this. Now we have Aruba switch and we have a range. This is a subset of this, but I'm just adding it to demonstrate to you when you use the template or the service, you can basically use that specific device, and that will make more sense from naming convention point of view also. We have two methods to add the service for the wired authentication, and we're going to use 802.1x wired authentication. You can add manual addition, you can add the service manually, which we will show you this as well. So I'm going to show you the two methods, templates and wizard, and you can even make it smaller. So even though at the top, so here 802.1x wired authentication, we're going to add a prefix here. Probably we can go for 802.1x wired authentication. Just to let you know the name you just added. You see the name listed because previously I added the name. So I'll just make it simple, wired 802.1x, and that's it. So you go to next. Here you decide where you would like to authenticate. So in this example, we're going to use local user repository. And then we're going to go next, and we will select, you're going to see two devices listed. We're going to select the Aruba switch. Then next, we will have nothing here. We will not use posture. There will be in the future video for the on guard. And go to next here. And obviously, we'll make it also very simple. And we say role name. And we're going to say employee, which is a built-in role name basically. Employee, so here. And that's a built-in role name. I'm going to copy this one, paste it everywhere, and we're going to change this one. That doesn't really, here we're just showing you simple stuff. In probably future videos we're going to show you more about the enforcement policies and so on. So we made it really extremely simple, and there we go. And why did we use employee? Because that is the role that we have assigned to the user we created before. Let me show you the service is here. Now, in this very specific example, there is no need to reorder because that's the only wired service. If you have multiple services for different purposes, then you can reorder. You can click on the reorder here and you can take it up if you like. We can take it up, no problem. So we click the mouse button and release and just move and press the left mouse button again, and that becomes the top. In reality, that doesn't really matter, but we'll show you how, we have shown you how to move a service a different position. Now going back to the local user that we have created in a previous video, we created a user called user1 with a role for that user we set as employee, and that's why we have used that employee. Now we'd like to simplify that service, so we go back to this service, click on it, And in the enforcement logic or the enforcement policy, I would like to make it as simple as possible. So this is fine, this will satisfy us, but we can always make changes to the service. So I would like to make it allow all, so it's very simple. And let's look at the service conditions here. So generic one, IETF, NAS port type 15, which is Ethernet. And this is typically, these two typically are inserted into the service. If I wanted to add the service as a manual addition, so that's the service name, wired 802.1x, so I can just also adjust the name. Okay, and then I would say, okay, so the name has changed to 802.1x wired. I can adjust the name again if you would like to. So assume that I would like to add one manually. So let's say add a service, and assume I'm going to use the simple authentication enforcement policy in the authentication. I will just make it a very simple one. Look at this. Adding a 802.1x wired, the type, this is the template type. It will immediately insert these two conditions, and that's it. I could add this, just also fine tune this one. If I use any other services, will automatically add the service conditions or the basic conditions for that service. And you can clearly see it's extremely simple. So here we can go for this again, going back. I can add one extra condition, let us say. I would like to specify that this service only for specific device, and that is 802. That is the switch that will authenticate the user. So we're going to specify the IP address for that switch specifically, or we can say that switch should be Aruba switch, and so on. So you can have multiple, if you like, conditions if you would like to do so. So I can say radius. I can say Aruba, so basically I'd like to go Aruba radius here. And you have multiple options here if you would like to. So I can say probably NAD, or let us say, I can add any other condition. So let's say device type. And device type equals, we might say equal a switch or something. Now, I'm not going to do this, but I'm saying you can basically add multiple conditions to make this service very specific for a very specific condition. Obviously, this one, we just give it a name, and the name is, say, wired 802.1x manual, just to distinguish this one from the other service, right? And we're going to just say, and remember the enforcement, this is allow policy, which is the default, and we can save it. Source, yes, we make sure that the configuration source is being configured, or the authentication source has been configured. And in this case, we're going to go for local user, basically. And this is, that's what will happen, local user. And obviously, we don't need all of this. Leave it for the time being. We're not going to touch it, and we're going to say save. So we can see we have added one here manually, and I'll show you later in later videos how to have more sophisticated conditions when you add the service in this case. Now we are done with the ClearPass itself. We need now to focus, or we look at our switch. We turn our attention into the switch itself and make sure that we are able to configure the switch, and I'll show you the configuration steps on the switch. Now that is the switch. Now what will happen? The client connects to this switch on interface number 5, and we're going to see now show interface brief. Interface 5 is enabled, but there is no yet authentication. It is down because the client card that connects to this interface is being shut down, and we'll come back to this, but would like to show you how to configure radius to authenticate on this specific switch. And the type of authentication we are going to use is basically 802.1x. Initially, we will configure the radius settings on this switch. This is Aruba OS switch, so just to confirm and make sure that you know where we are, show version. You can see this is a switch with operating system or firmware version 16.10. Okay, and we can see the initial command show module, for example. We can see this is chassis 2930F 8-port switch, and part number is GL258. Okay, and that's the serial number. So this is a switch that is 2930F switch, Aruba OS switch. And what I'm going to do now, I would just initially show you the radius configuration without much details in terms of options. We will not configure as many options. We will configure basic options here to make the switch able to enable radius configuration, and then later on we will the first two parts. The first part will be the radius part, and then the second part will be .1x authentication part, because radius is needed for even if you do MAC authentication, for example, or .1x authentication, you still need to do the same radius configuration on the switch. For simplicity, I'm going to copy and paste the radius config. I will leave the config in the comment in the video. So we're going to go to the global config. I'm going to go for global config here, and we're going to just paste the configuration in. So now the radius configuration has been performed. We can issue the command show radius, and we're going to see the radius config has been added here, and we can clearly see what is the radius server 10.254.23.1.23, the standard authentication and accounting port 1812, and the accounting port would be 1813. So that's a standard radius configuration on that switch. I will leave this configuration in the comment section of the video. The client will authenticate on VLAN 11. So in this case, we're going to just paste the config for the .1x authentication, and the client will be connected to interface number 5. So now VLAN, oh, VLAN 11, that's wrong VLAN. So we're going to just do VLAN 11 untagged 5. This is what the client is going to be connected to. So now we should see show port access authenticator. You should see nothing, but we have enabled the .1x authentication on the port number 5. We will pay attention to the client now. We can clearly see here the port access authenticator has been activated on that interface. Now that's the client where we'd like to connect to the interface. We're going to do a bunch of things. First of all, we will have to enable the authentication on the .1x authentication on the wired interface. So we're going to go to services. So open the services, and we will do the auto config enable. So I'll show you. We can search, so we can say wired auto config. By default it is manual and it is not enabled. We're going to start it, so the wired interface should have authentication enabled on that interface. And here we go to open network connection settings. We can scroll down here and we can go to Ethernet, network and sharing center. There we go. So here we're going to do a bunch of things. First of all, we're going to disable the wireless card. This is the only reason we do this, because of the way this the lab layout, and we will enable this one. So if you have a normal machine, normally you wouldn't need to do that, but this, now we can right click here and we can look at the properties, and now look at this trying to authenticate. It has failed authentication, and we are going to go to authentication, and you can clearly see authentication has a tab has been added here. Now once we do this, we need to do a few settings here. Basically this, because of certificate issues, we will untick this box, make sure that this is not the case here. We say okay. Again, in normal environment, you would push settings from Active Directory or some form of centralized mechanism. user authentication, and we would like to save the credentials. So the credentials we're going to use is user 1. So these are credentials we are going to use. This is the user we have created in ClearPass. I'm going to say OK. I'm going to say OK. If everything works fine, we will find ourselves have been authenticated, been accepted. Now you notice that this now has successfully authenticated. We look at the status here. We see details. We will notice that this client has picked up an IP address on that interface. Close, close here. Let's pay attention to the actual switch and see this. We're going to focus, we're going to look at the switch now. We'll look at the client and the switch, authenticate the client, as well as we will look at the ClearPass itself. And we're going to see in the access tracker what kind of authentication and what has happened upon the successful authentication in this case. Let's issue the same command as we have done before. So this was show, we're going to do show port access authenticator. We should see one client connected and one client has authenticated. Clearly see that the untagged VLAN in this case is VLAN 11. Now we have not shown that, how to dynamically assign a VLAN, but the focus of this video is to show you how to configure basic radius configuration on the switch, as well as how to configure .1x authentication on the switch. And the focus also was on how to configure the radius service on ClearPass. Now we've seen the client has authenticated successfully. We'll pay attention to our ClearPass. So in ClearPass, we should see an entry in the access tracker about that client that has authenticated. Notice this is the client that has authenticated. Notice this one before we done anything. So the client immediately automatically tried to authenticate, and it failed initially because we didn't really make any amendments. So you look at the alert. This alert immediately tells you there's a certificate error. And that's why we, on the client, we have just unticked the box for verification for the certificate, since the client doesn't trust the certificate that is used for the authentication. Later on we'll focus on certificate, but at least now we'd like to make sure that you understand the simple process, the basic process here. Right. So you notice that this is the access device, the NAT device. Obviously the status is accept, and that's a date, and that's end host identifier. This is the IP, the MAC address of the device of our client, and that's a username that was used. And notice that's the name, the IP address of the switch, and colon is the port number on that switch. So the client was connected to port number 5. The name of the switch and the health status, because we have not implemented any posture mechanism like on guard. And notice that authorization source and authentication source are the same, local host. Okay. And here enforcement profile is allow access. Basically we have allowed everything. And the fact that we enabled accounting on the switch configuration, we can see accounting information. Active, still alive, still active, network utility details, what happened, and so on. So calling station ID is the MAC address of the client. And if we look at the switch here, we can issue the command show system if you like. This is one of the ways to find out the MAC address of the switch. Look at this. The MAC address of the switch ends in BE40. And if you look at the ClearPass, the cold station ID, the one that is being used to issue the NAS or issue the authentication request, and that is the switch MAC address. If this was a controller, it would have been a controller MAC address. If that was an instant AP, it would have been an instant AP MAC address. That's a default behavior. Things can be changed, but again, we are not really looking for these things. In the output, you notice that allow access profile, everything is fine. Input, the request that comes from here, and the computed attributes is this is the what you're looking for when you troubleshoot, or if things don't work according to what you have configured. Yeah, these are the computed input where the ClearPass will look at these attributes to authenticate the user. Now we can just also use a different, if you like, enforcement profile. Just notice that in the enforcement profile, we have used allow access profile. We can just, to demo this, we can change the enforcement profile here. So simply speaking, we go and just change, we can disable this one, okay, and we're gonna just use the other one, manual. And the enforcement here, I'd like to change this one to secure enforcement wired authentication, and basically that's the enforcement profile name, and you're going to see that will change. So this just force the client to re-authenticate. Would like to disable the interface and enable the interface again. That will force the client to re-authenticate again. Interface 5 disabled. Now interface 5 enabled. Okay, hopefully that will force the client to re-authenticate. And if we look at the monitoring here, access tracker, you see the client has authenticated. And the fact, because we have disabled this service, and the only service that will meet the requirement for that client is that service. Notice the enforcement profile has changed because we did change it in the service. Assume we have made a mistake in the service itself. And I would like to disable both of these services to demonstrate the fact that if the client tried to authenticate and there's no service to meet the requirement, then it will be rejected. So look at this. This is disabled. We're going to disable this service by clicking on the green tick here. So these two services have been disabled now. Let's go back to the switch interface and disable it again to enforce re-authentication. So now we should expect to fail. The reason for that, because there's no service that can meet that category. So if we go monitor here, and you're gonna see, look at this, and notice there's no service, and it will see the message from rejection alert. Look at this, failed to classify request to service, meaning that request has not met any service conditions, and that's why it has failed. And if you look at the input here, radius request, or would like to go to the computed attributes, and you will notice, or the summary here even easier, you notice that there's no service that has been used or has been found to meet the requirement for that specific request, and the details as we have seen before. Simply speaking, because probably in real life, either we made a mistake or you have not created the service that is properly serving the request from that client. So hopefully this is a good demonstration for you guys on how to configure basic radius configuration, basic .1x authentication on the switch, and the corresponding service on the ClearPass. Obviously, there will be other videos to show you how to dynamically, for example, assign a VLAN, how to send some other parameters, and how to use this to authenticate using dynamic segmentation. So this is going to be the basis for dynamic segmentation for the future. If you look at just last thing in here, if you look at the switch, you can issue this command, show port access authenticator. You can see that unauthenticated client is 1. It has failed to authenticate. If we amend, or we go back and enable that service again, that will fix the issue. So in our case, we simulated a failure. Now we're going to just simulate, or we're going to just re-enable that service. And if we just disable port 5 and re-enable it again, and then we should see the client authenticate successfully. Now we see the client has been authenticated and the client was assigned VLAN 11. Thank you. So looking into the ClearPass, and look at the monitor, you're going to see successful authentication and with the expected service to serve the client request.